On September 1st, 1944, General George Patton's Third Army stopped moving. Not because of the Germans were running. After the breakout from Normandy in late July, after the encirclement at Falaise, where 10,000 German soldiers died and 50,000 were captured, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat. The road to Germany was open. In a way it would not be open again. Patton understood this and knew that the moment was closing. He needed fuel. 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day. 28 American divisions advancing across France and Belgium. Each division required 700 to 750 tons per day. Total daily requirement? 20,000 tons. And there was no way to deliver it. The reason was a decision made months before the invasion. Destroy the French railway system to prevent Rommel from reinforcing the Normandy coast. The logic was sound. The bombing campaign worked. By D-Day, the French rail network was devastated. Bridges down, yards destroyed, locomotives wrecked. But what prevented the Germans from supplying Rommel also prevented the Allies from supplying Patton. The Channel ports were either in German hands or demolished by the retreating Germans. The only functioning supply entry point, the Normandy beaches, 300 miles behind the front. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every K-ration, 300 miles of damaged French roads. Not enough trucks, on roads not designed for military convoys, to cover 300 miles twice a day. Patton's tanks sat at the side of French roads, fuel gauges empty. The answer was simple. Nobody had built the system to deliver it. What happened next was something the American military would later describe with justifiable pride. In 36 hours, working through the night, American commanders invented a solution. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name from a railroad phrase, to red ball meant to ship express. Two parallel highways between the beaches and the front. Northbound, supplies. Southbound, empty trucks returning. Military police at every intersection. Civilian traffic forbidden. They took men from infantry, artillery, anti-aircraft units, any unit with trucks and spare bodies. Men who had never driven anything larger than a pickup truck received a few hours of instruction on the GMC 6x6 and were sent out. And they called on the men who were already there. The men who had been driving trucks since the invasion. Loading and unloading ammunition at the ports. Running supplies to forward depots. Doing the work the Army had decided, based on its assessment of who was and was not qualified for combat, that they should do. The men of the Quartermaster Corps. 75% of them were African American. The United States Army in 1944 was a segregated institution. Black soldiers could not serve in most combat units, could not command white troops, could not eat in the same mess halls or sleep in the same barracks. The military had decided, based on racial theory and institutional inertia that had survived 2 world wars, that black men were not suited for combat. They were suited for driving. So the Army gave them trucks and told them to drive. From the beaches to the front. 300 miles. 22 hours a day. Through night and rain and Luftwaffe strafing runs and roads mined by retreating Germans. Through the exhaustion of a man so long behind the wheel that the white line ahead has become a kind of hypnosis, and the only thing keeping him awake is the knowledge that the tank at the end of the road is waiting. Patton was at the end of the road. He did not know who was driving. He knew the gasoline had to arrive. August 25th, 1944. The Red Ball Express officially began. Within 5 days, it was moving 12,342 tons of supplies per day, a record unbroken for the remaining 14 weeks of its existence. At its peak, 6,000 trucks simultaneously on the road 24 hours a day, a convoy stretching from the Normandy beaches to the front lines of the most rapid advance in American military history. 75% of the men driving those trucks were black soldiers who were not permitted to fight the enemy they were supplying the ammunition to kill. Washington Rector was 22 years old when he joined the Red Ball Express. The records are incomplete in the way that records of black soldiers' lives are often incomplete. The segregated army preserved officers' careers and combat units' exploits with more care than it preserved quartermaster truck drivers' names and hometowns. His unit, the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company. What he preserved himself, in interviews decades after the war, was the specific texture of what it meant to drive for the Red Ball. He said, "You accepted discrimination. You were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise." Said matter-of-factly, the way a man describes weather conditions. Not with bitterness, or rather, the kind of bitterness so thoroughly absorbed into daily experience that it no longer presents itself as bitterness, but simply as information about the world. The 3916th drove the same roads as every other Red Ball unit. The same parallel highways, one way north for loaded trucks, one way south for empty returns. The same cat eyes, white front, red back, that turned night convoys into rivers of ghostly light stretching horizon to horizon. The same 25-mile-per-hour speed limit that everyone ignored, governors stripped so the overloaded trucks could maintain pace on the long grades. The same exhaustion. The Army calculated 60-yard intervals and convoy discipline. Reality was a driver behind the wheel for 18 hours, watching red cat eyes and trying to remember whether he had slept in the last 24. The co-driver, theoretically resting, awaiting his turn, also asleep, head against the window, gone. Robert Emmerich, of the 3581st, remembered almost dying from sleep. Barreling along in convoy, cat eyes the only fixed point in the darkness, then a bump and blaring horns. He had nodded off and was careening toward a concrete electrical pole. Swerved back in time. The solution for those who had figured it out: wire C-ration tins to the exhaust manifold to heat the food. The warmth, the smell, the small task of remembering to retrieve the tin. These kept a man present. One driver forgot. The tin exploded. His motor pool sergeant was not sympathetic. August 29, 1944, 4 days in. 132 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles, 12,342 tons. The record stood for the remaining 14 weeks, set by men who were not permitted to fight. Here is what 12,342 tons looked like in practice. Approximately 800,000 gallons of gasoline. 1 day's consumption for Patton's army. Enough artillery ammunition for 2 days of sustained fire by a full corps. Food for 400,000 men for a day. The specific, concrete, unglamorous material that modern armies are made of, and that histories mention briefly before returning to the battles. The battles could not happen without it. Patton understood logistics in the abstract. He did not know Washington Rector's name. Did not know the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company. He knew his fuel arrived, mostly, and when it did not, he communicated his dissatisfaction to logistics officers. The daily grinding problem of keeping 6,000 trucks on the road, damaged roads, limited parts, exhausted drivers, Luftwaffe strafing runs, was solved by the men of the Quartermaster Corps. 75% of them black. None of them in the history books. Washington Rector remembered, decades later, a soldier learning that he was a Red Ball driver and asking, incredulously, why he was not black. Rector had driven the fuel that moved the army that won the war. He was still being asked to explain his presence. The Red Ball Express officially ended on November 16, 1944. Ports open, railways repaired. In 83 days, 412,193 tons moved. Patton's name went into the history books. The Bulge, the Rhine crossing, the liberation of the camps. Documented, studied, filmed. The Red Ball Express is a footnote. The men who drove it are less than that. This is what Rector meant when he said, "You accepted discrimination." Not past tense, continuous. Before the war, during it, driving 22 hours a day in a country not your own for a country that was not yet yours. And after. On August 29, 1944, the day the Red Ball set its record, a convoy driver named John O'Leary of the 3628th Truck Company was somewhere between Normandy and the front, driving his third consecutive shift. He had been awake for 20 hours. The motto, tout de suite, immediately, now. O'Leary remembered Patton's directive with the clarity of a man who has heard an order so many times it has become the condition of existence. Patton wanted us to eat, sleep, and drive, but mostly drive. Each loaded GMC 6x6 could carry approximately 5 tons, overloaded up to 10. The 300-mile round trip took 10 to 12 hours in good conditions. In actual conditions, mined roads, traffic jams, breakdowns, 2-hour rest stops in the cab, longer. There were never enough drivers. Philip Dick, a scout corporal with the 381st Field Artillery, had never driven a truck before. A few hours of instruction and he was sent out. Everybody was stripping gears, but by the time we got back to the company area, we could make the trucks go. Making the trucks go was the irreducible minimum. Governors were stripped off and hidden under seats, reinstalled before inspections, removed again as soon as the inspector's vehicle cleared. Weight limits were ignored in practice by every quartermaster officer who understood that the front's needs exceeded what regulations permitted to load. In the first month, Red Ball trucks wore out 40,000 tires. Batteries dried up, engines overheated, transmissions overstressed. Treads came loose on inside dual tires and caught fire from friction. German prisoners used as rear area labor knew that water in the gas was the GMC 6x6's weakness, and dragged jerry cans through rain with caps open. Mechanics, also disproportionately black, worked around the clock. The Diamond T prime mover Rector, strong enough to drag a disabled tank, was last resort when a truck broke down too badly for roadside repair. Drivers pulled over when the alternative was blocking a convoy lane. Otherwise, they kept moving. The route itself was improvisation. Original circuit, Beaches to Chartres. As the front moved east, the route extended to Soissons, to Somseux, to Arcis-sur-Aube. The loop grew with the advance. Military police at intersections enforced priority absolutely. A French car trapped between two barreling trucks was the car's problem. One convoy stopped at an intersection blockage and discovered it had driven too far forward. The MPs were German. 12,342 tons. In a single day, on civilian highways 6 months earlier, driven by men who had been truck drivers for 6 weeks, the Red Ball moved enough supplies to sustain Patton's entire army for a day and a half. The system that had not existed on August 24th moved 12,342 tons on August 29th. This was the specific American capability the German military, for all its professional excellence, had never built: the ability to improvise at scale. To take an unanticipated problem, build a solution in 36 hours, and have it at peak capacity within 5 days. The Germans had built better tanks. The Americans had built a better system for keeping armies fed. Patton was unaware of the specific miracle being performed on his behalf. His diary noted the supply situation in terms of what was lacking and what he required, not who was providing it. He required gasoline. He received gasoline. The chain of custody between the gasoline on the beaches and the gasoline in his tanks. The 6,000 trucks, the 83 days, the 412,193 tons, the men driving 22 hours a day in a segregated army, did not appear in Patton's diary. It did not appear in most histories of the campaign. The Red Ball Express moved an army across France. The men who were driving knew they were doing the job the Army had decided was appropriate for them. Not because driving a 6x6 down a mined French highway required less courage than charging a German position, but because the Army had decided, on the basis of race, that this was where they belonged. They drove anyway. Patton crossed the Seine, crossed the Rhine, entered Germany. The men of the Quartermaster Corps went home to segregated America and a question with no good answer. What exactly had they been fighting for? The question of what black soldiers were fighting for was not new in 1944. Asked in every American war since the Revolution. Black men fought at Bunker Hill, Gettysburg, the Argonne, for a country that did not recognize them as full citizens. In segregated units fighting beside white soldiers for the same cause. The answer most had arrived at. For the same things white soldiers were fighting for. For the people at home. For the end of the war. For whatever came after. Washington Rector put it simply. You accepted discrimination. But accepting discrimination is not the same as accepting the premise of discrimination. The men of the Red Ball Express accepted that they would be asked to drive trucks while white soldiers were asked to fight. They did not accept that this made them less capable of fighting. They did not accept that driving the truck required less courage than riding in the tank the truck was supplying. The Army's argument: black soldiers were not suited for combat, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the specific cultural conditioning that made men fight effectively as units under pressure. The argument made after every war in which black soldiers had served with distinction, that the exceptions proved the rule. The general principle was wrong. The men of the Red Ball Express were not less brave, not less capable of fighting, less permitted to fight. And here is the arithmetic that the Army's logic chose not to examine. A Red Ball driver delivering fuel 200 miles from the German lines was not behind the battle. He was part of it. The roads were mined. The Luftwaffe strafed convoys. German saboteurs contaminated fuel supplies. The driver who fell asleep and crashed into a concrete pole did not die in combat, but he died in service of the same cause on the same night for the same reasons. The line between logistics and combat in a modern mechanized war is not a sharp one. Fred Reese, a mechanic in an ETO ambulance unit, described the Red Ball drivers. They had no fear. Those guys were crazy, like they were getting paid for every run. Not crazy. Men doing a dangerous job, sustained by the pride of people told they cannot do something, deciding to demonstrate otherwise. Not by fighting, by driving. One Red Ball veteran remembered delivering ammunition to artillery positions within a few miles of the front. Another remembered driving gasoline directly to a stranded Sherman while the Germans were within shouting distance, passing jerry cans through the window of a truck, carrying enough fuel to produce an explosion visible from the next county. Combat experiences. The Army did not classify them as such. Charles Stevenson of the 3,858th Quartermaster Gas Supply Company was stopped by a 3rd Army colonel who demanded his truckloads of jerry cans. We fussed, jumped up and down, and cussed that colonel and raised hell, Stevenson recalled. The colonel was unmoved. The gasoline went to Patton's tanks. They drove. They delivered. They kept the convoys moving on roads that should have stopped them, and in conditions that should have broken them. And when the war ended, they went home. To a country that was still arguing about where they could sit on the bus. The Army believed black soldiers were not capable of combat. The Army then built the Red Ball Express and staffed it 75% with the soldiers it had deemed incapable of combat. The logic? Truck driving was not combat. But the road between the beaches and the front was not a support environment. Mined roads, strafing runs, contaminated fuel. night driving on blackout lights through territory where the nearest German was not always known. The men doing this were not trusted to fight. They were trusted to drive fuel to the men who were trusted to fight, through conditions requiring the same qualities: courage, endurance, willingness to continue under fire, that the army said they lacked. And they did it. Without them, Patton stops. Without Patton, the campaign extends into winter. The history books remember Patton. The men who kept Patton moving are a footnote. This is the arithmetic of discrimination. The people without power do the work. The people with power get the credit. In August 1944, the city of Paris was liberated. French crowds, the Champs-Élysées, de Gaulle under the Arc de Triomphe. The photographs of Paris's liberation are among the most reproduced images of the Second World War, the moment when the war in the West felt, for a few days, like a celebration. The Red Ball Express drove through it. Not through the celebration, the Red Ball's route bypassed Paris to maintain traffic flow, but through the war that made the celebration possible. The fuel for the tanks, the ammunition for the artillery, the food for the soldiers who had marched from the beaches to the Seine in 7 weeks. By the time Paris was liberated, the Red Ball had been running for 5 days. The men driving it had been behind the wheel for approximately 120 hours. The photographs show soldiers and crowds. They do not show the truck convoys that made the soldiers' presence possible. Logistics is always outside the frame. The general gets the credit for the victory the supply sergeant made possible. The tank commander gets the medal for the engagement the fuel truck driver delivered the fuel for. But in the case of the Red Ball Express, the man outside the frame was also outside another frame, American citizenship as it was understood in 1944. The black soldier driving the fuel truck was invisible in the history of the campaign, and invisible in the country the campaign was being fought to defend. He could not vote in most southern states, could not sit at the lunch counter, could not serve as an equal, and he drove anyway. Chester Jones, of the 3,418th, told the story of a soldier whose Jeep got sandwiched between 2 Red Ball trucks on the priority route and couldn't get off for 100 miles. The convoys gunned down the middle of the highway and stopped for nothing. Military police enforced priority with the absolutism of men who understood that stopping was not an option. Red Ball signs at every intersection, convoy directors with maps, military police directing traffic, engineers patrolling roads. The trucks, 6,000 of them at peak, moving continuously, around the clock, in convoys stretching horizon to horizon. The roads of northern France had been designed for peacetime agricultural and commercial traffic. Damaged by the bombing campaign that destroyed the railway system. Further damaged by the German retreat. Deliberate destruction of bridges and road surfaces wherever the Germans had time. Over these roads, drivers hauled loads exceeding the truck's rated capacity by factors of 2 and sometimes 3. The GMC 6x6 was rated for 2.5 tons. Red Ball convoys routinely loaded 5, sometimes approaching 10. Weight regulations ignored because the need exceeded them. 40,000 tires in the first month. Engines overheated. Transmissions failed. Drive shafts fell off. Ordnance troops worked through the night. Diamond T wreckers patrolled the routes. Falling asleep at the wheel was not a risk on the Red Ball. It was a near certainty. Night convoys under blackout, cat eyes front and back, no headlights. The hypnosis of red taillights in darkness for hours had put men to sleep and driven them off the road and into concrete poles and bridge abutments. The Army's solution? 2-driver system, one resting while the other drove. In practice, both were often asleep when the truck drifted off the road. Rest areas, cots, coffee, cold sea rations. Red Cross girls at the larger stops offered donuts. Drivers who stopped heated rations on exhaust manifolds. Those who couldn't stop ate while driving, or didn't eat. The Army counted the tonnage. It did not count the sleep the tonnage cost. The men of the Red Ball counted it. For a war they believed in. For an enemy they wanted defeated. For a future that might include them on equal terms. Might. And might was better than the alternative. And also because there was a truck in front of them with red taillights, and a truck behind that would run into them if they stopped, and stopping was not permitted. Tout de suite. Immediately. Now. On September 2nd, 1944, Patton's Third Army crossed the Meuse River. Possible because of gasoline, because the Red Ball had delivered enough in the previous week to allow the armor to continue moving. Without the Red Ball, Patton's tanks stop at the Seine, and the German army has time to organize the defense of its own border. Patton did not say this. He had been saying, since August, that he needed more gasoline than he was receiving. The demand exceeded even what 6,000 trucks driving around the clock could deliver. What he did not say, because it did not occur to him, the men making the delivery possible were black soldiers in a segregated army who were not permitted to fight the enemy they were supplying the ammunition to kill. This is not a criticism of Patton specifically. It is an observation about the architecture of invisibility that surrounded the Red Ball and its drivers. The supply sergeant has always been less celebrated than the colonel, but the specific invisibility of the Red Ball was compounded by race. The men who drove the Red Ball were black. The men who commanded the armies they supplied were white. The history of the campaign, written from records the Army had preserved, and the Army had preserved generals' records more carefully than quartermaster truck company records, was a history of the white men who had commanded the campaign. The black men who had made the campaign possible were in the footnotes. Colonel John Eisenhower wrote, years after the war, "The spectacular nature of the advance was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks." An extraordinary acknowledgement from a military professional. Without them, the tanks don't move. It did not say, and the men who drove the trucks were black soldiers who went home to a country that did not treat them as equals. The military history of the Second World War is a history of tactics, strategy, logistics, command. Not a history of who was doing the logistics and under what conditions. The two facts are not separate. They are the same fact seen from different angles. The United States won the war in Europe in part because of the Red Ball Express. The Red Ball Express was staffed 75% by black soldiers deemed incapable of combat. Capable of driving fuel through mined roads at night while the Luftwaffe strafed them. Not capable of fighting. The distinction was not military, it was racial. Rector accepted it the way a man accepts weather. Not accepting it was not an option the world of 1944 provided. He warned his men. He drove. He delivered. He won his war, and went home to the country that had sent him. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched the Battle of the Bulge. Patton's Third Army was ordered to turn north and relieve Bastogne. Patton turned 200,000 men and 50,000 vehicles 90 degrees in 72 hours through Belgian winter. Military historians call it one of the most impressive logistics feats in American military history. The men who drove the fuel that made the turn possible were, again, disproportionately black. Patton received the credit. The drivers are in the footnotes. Washington Rector went home in 1945 to a country that had not changed in the months he had been driving fuel for Patton. The argument about what black Americans had earned through military service continued for another 20 years. Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma, before the country began, imperfectly, to change. But the Red Ball Express is part of that argument. You cannot tell the story of how America won the war in Europe without the Red Ball. You cannot tell the Red Ball without the men who drove it. Those men were black, and they were driving for a country that had not yet decided they were worth the same as the men whose tanks they were fueling. There is a specific image that survivors of the Red Ball Express describe when they are asked what they remember most. Not the danger, not the exhaustion, not the specific terror of a Luftwaffe fighter sweeping in low, machine gun fire walking down the column, drivers diving from their cabs into ditches. The image most of them return to is the light. At night, on the Red Ball route, the convoys moved under blackout conditions. No headlights, only the cat eyes, small hooded running lights that showed a white glow to the front and a red one to the rear, just bright enough to allow the driver behind to maintain position without being visible to enemy aircraft from above. And the convoys were long. Dozens of trucks, hundreds, stretching back so far that you couldn't see the end. So what you saw, if you stood at the side of the road and watched the Red Ball pass at night, was a river of red lights stretching from horizon to horizon, moving slowly, steady, continuous, not stopping. From the inside, from behind the wheel of the GMC 6x6, you were one of the red lights. The truck in front was a pair of red cat eyes in the darkness. You followed them. The truck behind followed yours. This continued forward and backward as far as the system extended, all the way to the beaches, all the way to the front. The system did not stop. Robert Emmerich of the 3581st remembered the cat eyes driving him blind. It was like hypnosis, he said. You'd be watching those damned little blackout lights and it would drive you blind. The cat eyes in front were not a specific person. They were a function, a role, a position in the convoy. The cat eyes behind were the same. You were also a function. The specific truck in the specific place in the specific convoy at the specific hour. Your job was to keep moving. You kept moving because stopping was not permitted. This is also a description of what it felt like to be a black soldier in 1944 America. Not a person with a specific history and specific capabilities the country had not bothered to assess. A function, a role, a position assigned not on individual capability, but on category. The category being, in this case, black. The Army had decided the category: quartermaster, truck driver, support, not combat. And the men in the category drove. They drove because coming home required the war to end, and the war ending required Patton to cross the Rhine, and crossing the Rhine required fuel, and fuel required trucks, and trucks required drivers. They drove because stopping was not permitted. And they drove with something harder to document than tonnage and harder to count than miles. They drove with pride. Not the simple pride of men doing a job well, though the record of August 29th proves they were. Something more complicated. The pride of men told they were not capable of the demanding parts of the job, who responded by demonstrating that the demanding parts were not the parts the institution had been paying attention to. Driving a fuel truck through mined roads at night while the Luftwaffe strafed the convoy was demanding. The Army had decided it was not combat. Fred Reese remembered, they had no fear. Those guys were crazy, like they were getting paid for every run. Not crazy. Men who understood that the job in front of them was the job they had, not the job they wanted, not the job they deserved, the job they had. And they did it. Not for the history books. The history books, they had reason to believe, would not pay much attention to them. For the cat eyes in front, and the cat eyes behind, and the road between the beaches and the front, and the men at the end of the road who needed what they were carrying. Because stopping was not permitted, and because stopping was not who they were. The Red Ball's name was so embedded in the campaign that most men who drove trucks in France, even after the route's demise, believed they were on the Red Ball. The other express lines became footnotes to a footnote. The original Red Ball, August 25th to November 16th, 1944, 412,193 tons in 83 days, was 75% black. The men who drove it knew what they had done. They had driven the fuel that moved the army. They had moved the army that ended the war. As men who were not, in the eyes of the army and the country they served, fully capable of the demands of war. In 1948, 3 years after the war ended, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. The order desegregated the United States military. 3 years after the war ended, the men who had driven the red ball had gone home, to Jim Crow laws, voting restrictions, separate water fountains, the specific daily indignities of a country that had sent them to fight for democracy and was not yet willing to provide it to them. Truman's order was a beginning, not an end. The Civil Rights Act was 16 years away. The men who had driven the red ball were, in 1948, still living in the country they had left in 1942, the country that had decided, based on race, what they were capable of. But something had shifted. The men who had served came home with a specific knowledge the country had not given them and could not take away. They knew what they had done, not as a general abstraction, specifically. Patton's army had needed their fuel. The advance through France had needed their trucks. The timeline of the war, how long it lasted, how many people died, had been shaped, in part, by the specific work they had done in the summer and fall of 1944. They knew this even when the history books did not say it. Washington Rector knew it. He had accepted discrimination. He had warned his men. He had done his job under conditions the Army did not classify as combat and any reasonable definition would have. He had driven the fuel that moved the Army that won the war. This knowledge, specific, documentable, arithmetically verifiable, was what the returning soldiers carried home. It was not enough. It was not justice. But it was true. In the specific circumstances of Black Americans in 1945, truth had a particular weight. That your service had mattered, that the country could not have won without you, a leverage point. Not immediately, not without 20 years of struggle, but a leverage point. They came home knowing the argument about what they were capable of was demonstrably wrong. The Army had said, not suited for combat, support services. The men of the Red Ball. We drove fuel through mined roads at night while the Luftwaffe strafed us. We set a record on August 29th that held for 14 weeks. We moved 412,193 tons in 83 days. We kept Patton moving when nothing else could have. You tell us what that is, if it is not demanding. The country was not ready to answer in 1945. Not for another 20 years. The men who had driven the Red Ball would be middle-aged before the Civil Rights Act passed. The work was real. The record was real. The 412,193 tons were real. And the country's argument that these men were not capable, that the category the Army had put them in was correct, had been answered on the roads of France in the summer and fall of 1944. We drove when you told us to drive, further and faster than you expected. Without the recognition the work deserved. We did our job. Now you do yours. This is the argument the Red Ball Express makes, if you let it. Not about tactics or logistics. About what the country owed the men who drove them. The Army needed drivers. The Army needed to supply Patton. The country needed to win a war against an enemy committed to a theory of racial hierarchy that the United States had officially rejected. The United States had officially rejected the Nazi theory of racial hierarchy while maintaining a military that practiced its own. One that said black soldiers could drive trucks but not fight wars. The contradiction had been present in every American war since the Revolution. What was new in 1944 was the scale. The 6,000 trucks, the 412,193 tons. The documentable contribution of Black Americans to a war being fought, in part, against racism. Rector drove his trucks. Emmerich followed the cat eyes through the dark. O'Leary kept the convoy moving when everything in his body said stop. They were not fighting for racial equality. They were fighting because there was a war and stopping was not permitted. But they were also fighting for racial equality. Every mile demonstrated that the theory that had put them in quartermaster companies instead of infantry divisions was wrong. Demonstrating it by driving. Tout de suite. Remember George Patton on September 1st, 1944? His tanks are stopped, not by the Germans, by the absence of fuel. The advance from Normandy to the German border in less than 3 months halted, because there is no gasoline. He has been demanding gasoline for weeks. He has been told, railways destroyed, ports insufficient, trucks not enough. He has heard all of this and demanded more gasoline anyway. And the gasoline arrives, not because Patton demanded it, because 6,000 trucks, driven around the clock by men the Army had decided were not suited for combat, were moving fuel from the beaches to the front through the night and the rain and the Luftwaffe strafing runs and the exhaustion of a man 20 hours behind the wheel watching red cat eyes. The gasoline arrives because Washington Rector is driving, because Robert Emmerich is following the cat eyes through the dark, because John O'Leary is keeping the convoy moving when everything in his body says stop, because the men of the Quartermaster Corps, 75% of them black, none of them in the history books that Patton's campaign produced, built an operation in 36 hours and ran it for 83 days and moved 412,193 tons. Patton advances. Now remember Washington Rector in 1945. The war is over. The country he left is the country he returned to. Jim Crow still in effect. The architecture of a society that has decided, based on race, who belongs where, still standing. He had accepted discrimination, done the job under conditions any reasonable person would call demanding, in service of a war fought partly against an enemy committed to racial hierarchy. He is back now. The war is won. The country is the same. Here is what the Red Ball Express means in the fullest sense. Not just a logistics story, not just 6,000 trucks moving 412,193 tons in 83 days. It is all of those things. Also, the story of a country at war with itself, fighting racial hierarchy abroad while maintaining its own at home, fighting for democracy while practicing discrimination. Colonel Eisenhower wrote, "The spectacular nature of the advance was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks." This is true. It is also incomplete. The complete version. The men who drove the Red Ball came home to a country still arguing about whether they deserved to sit at the same lunch counter as the men who drove the tanks. The history books recorded Patton's advance from Normandy to the Rhine, the breakout, Falaise, the race across France, the Bulge, Bastogne, the names of the generals. They did not record, not prominently, that the advance was possible because of 6,000 trucks driven around the clock by men the Army had deemed unfit for combat. They did not record that 3/4 of those men were black. They did not record what those men went home to. These facts are not secret. They are in the archives, the after-action reports, the memoirs of the men who drove. Colonel Eisenhower said, "The trucks mattered as much as the tanks." The record of August 29th is documented. The facts are there. They are just not the headline. Patton is the headline. The Red Ball is the footnote. Washington Rector is less than a footnote. The men who drove the Red Ball were not asking for a headline. They were asking for the country they had helped save to acknowledge, in the most basic terms, that they were its citizens. Full citizens, with the rights the word implies. They drove the fuel that moved the army that won the war. They asked for the vote. It took 20 years. In the summer of 1944, the the most advanced industrial nation in the world, discovered that it could not move fast enough. Not because the tanks were too slow, not because the soldiers were too few, not because the generals were incompetent, because the fuel could not keep up. And the solution, the specific, improvised 36-hour solution that kept the advance going, was 6,000 trucks and the men who drove them. Black men, mostly. Men the army had decided were not suited for combat. Men who were driving through mined roads and Luftwaffe strafing runs, through the exhaustion of a human being operating a machine for 22 hours in a row, through the night and the rain and the cat eyes and the river of red lights stretching from horizon to horizon. 412,193 tons in 83 days. The standard histories do not lead with 412,193 tons. It should be. 412,193 tons is what kept the advance going. What kept Patton moving when the German army was running and the Allied armies had the chance to catch it. What the campaign's timing, the window that allowed the war to end in spring 1945 rather than fall, depended on. 3/4 of the men who moved those tons were Black Americans serving in a segregated army, fighting an enemy committed to racial hierarchy while their own country maintained its own. This is the sentence the standard histories do not write. Not because the facts are unknown, because the facts do not fit comfortably into the narrative. American triumph, democracy's victory over fascism, the greatest generation answering the call. The narrative is true. It is also incomplete. The complete narrative includes the men of the Red Ball Express, what they drove, what they were driving for, the war, the country, and something they were not yet certain the country would give them, but were driving toward anyway. Washington Rector drove his trucks. Robert Emmerich followed the cat eyes. John O'Leary kept the convoy moving when everything in his body says stop. They did not stop. Not when roads were mined, not when the Luftwaffe came, not when exhaustion became the kind of thing that breaks men, not when discrimination had become weather, something to navigate rather than challenge. They did not stop because the war needed them to keep going, and because underneath the war and the army and the segregation, underneath all of that, they were driving toward something. Not just Patton's front line, something further. The something further took 20 years to arrive. It arrived imperfectly, and it is still arriving. But the men of the Red Ball Express drove toward it in the dark, following cat eyes they could barely see, on roads not designed for what they were doing, in a country not yet ready to be what they needed it to be. They drove anyway, tout de suite, because stopping was not permitted, and because they were the men who kept going. They moved 412,193 tons. Patton advanced. The war ended. They went home. They won a war for a country that wouldn't let them sit at the same lunch counter. They drove anyway. That is the whole story. That is all of it, except for this. Washington Rector, asked decades later about his experience, did not talk primarily about the danger or exhaustion or discrimination. He talked about accepting it. You accepted discrimination, he said. You were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise. Without visible bitterness, the way a man describes weather. But accepting discrimination in the context of a man driving fuel through mined roads at night while the Luftwaffe strafed his convoy means he did the job anyway, kept the convoy moving anyway, did not stop. The discrimination was real. The acceptance was not surrender. It was the specific endurance that produces, over time, the momentum that becomes movement, that becomes change. Rector drove in 1944. Martin Luther King marched in 1955. The Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Not the same event, part of the same story. The story of people who accepted what they could not immediately change, did the work that needed doing, and kept going. Tout de suite, immediately, now, and also, eventually.